Right, with us now from Capitol Hill, the ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff from California. Also with us from Washington, senior foreign affairs correspondent for Politico, Michael Crowley. Let me begin with you, Congressman. A lot of us concerned, very concerned, that the situation in Syria goes from bad to worse. And now Vladimir Putin moving military hardware into Syria and looking like Russia's going to have a forward air base in the Middle East for the first time in decades. What do we do to stop that? How much worse can it get in Syria before we actually do something?
Well, it's a very difficult problem, and it has the prospect of just dragging out the civil war in Syria even longer if Russia tries to prop up Assad. Unclear, I think, what the primary motivation is here, except that Putin wants to flex his muscles and have a role either in trying to rescue Assad or in trying to help decide what successor government ought to take over after Assad. Hopefully it's more of the latter, because if the Russians try to prop up Assad, we're in for more years of this horrendous conflict.
Michael Crowley, do you sense from your reporting, is everybody on the same page? The White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, the NSC, are they all on the same page with regard to going forward in Syria?
No, I'm not sure they are. And I mean, I asked somebody recently who tracks our Syria policy very closely, who's in charge of our Syria policy? And he said to me, which Syria policy? We're running, there's CIA, the rebels. The Pentagon has this kind of incredibly ill-fated training program that produced several dozen guys who were either kidnapped or have dispersed. We have diplomatic efforts that are constantly shifting and changing, and it's not all coordinated. So I think it's impossible for everyone to be on the same page. I would add that what we're seeing Russia do is really frustrating, and in some ways, another big affront to the U.S., because after the Iran deal, you heard Secretary of State John Kerry and people in the administration saying, hey, it looks like Vladimir Putin is open to working with us in Syria to try to get Assad out and set up some kind of political settlement there, which is what the president says is necessary. You can't have a military solution. You have to have this grand political deal. And Putin is starting to sound reasonable. Well, now here we see him doubling down. It does not sound like he really is ready to work with us in that regard, and we're kind of back to square one.
Actually, worse than square one. Just worse than square one. And Willie?
Congressman, it's Willie Geist. As you watch this humanitarian crisis unfold now, spreading from the Middle East up across Europe with tens of thousands, with many millions more behind them, streaming into Europe, how much responsibility do you think the United States bears for not intervening in Syria sooner?
Well, it's a very hard question because our options are limited. Had we gone on earlier, had we introduced ground troops, the situation could have been very different. In many respects, we could be there 10 years from now with ground troops, much as we are in Iraq and Afghanistan. It may have thwarted this humanitarian catastrophe, or it may have just immersed us in it even to a greater degree. But I do think that along with Europe, along with the rest of the world, we do have a humanitarian responsibility here, whether we could have fended this off or not. And I think that means that we have to, for one thing, accept those that have applied for immigration in the United States, that have families here,
right,
about 20,000.
But Congressman, until Syria is stable, the humanitarian crisis continues. We're treating the symptoms of the much larger disease, which is in Syria. It's an unstable, chaotic Syria.
Joe, I agree with that completely. The problem is that what are the recommendations for action in Syria? This is where it always gets difficult. I think we all recognize it's a disaster.
Again, Adam, and I don't mean to be short with you here, but let's talk about that, because it's something that we've been debating for some time, actually off screen. We heard that it was difficult when 20,000 people had been killed by Assad, and when 40,000, and when 80,000, when 100,000, when 200,000, and then when ISIS started spreading. I mean, we've been wringing our hands as a nation, and I'm not blaming the president. Republicans didn't want to go to war in Syria either. But we've been wringing our hands as a nation over Syria now for 2 years, and it only keeps getting worse. We're wringing our hands now, and the Russians are going into Syria. At what point do we as a country come together in a policy to take care of not only the humanitarian crisis, but the geopolitical crisis that's occurring right now in Syria?
Joe, I would love to say now is the time to do that, and here's how we can do it. The problem is it gets very difficult when you get to the here's how we do it. Are we really prepared to put massive troops on the ground? Because that's what it would take to really get control of the situation in Syria. And after Iraq and Afghanistan, there's simply no appetite to do that. There's no appetite among the American people to see American lives lost, to try to separate largely Muslims from fighting other Muslims in Syria.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think we have a limited range of options. We are utilizing those to the best that we can. I do think you're right that we ought to have a new focus and a comprehensive view on our Syria policy to decide, is there a different way forward? I wish I could tell you what that way ought to look like.
I understand what you're saying. It's hard to hear, though, when you look at Lester Holt's reporting and you see the child that was burned and lost his family as one of millions of tragic stories of migrants now fleeing, trying to get a better life.
By the way, the images we haven't been seeing over the past couple of years, barrel bombs being used by Assad, the chemical weapons being used by Assad.
Michael Crowley, I know you're taking part in an event later today with the Chicago Council, which did a survey of public opinion on U.S. foreign policy. 2 findings I'll start with. Should the U.S. play an active role in world affairs now, as opposed to 2014? 64% to no, 35%. Also, shared leadership role in terms of the U.S. role in the world. Should we have shared leadership? 63%. The dominant leader, the U.S., 28%. I mean, it's convoluted. We don't want to do it alone, that's for sure. But do we want to step out and let the Middle East just roil?
Well, no, I don't think so. It is true that that poll, and by the way, the event is tomorrow for those who want to go. Hope you'll tune in or join. Nobody wants us to go completely alone, but the appetite for having a more active American foreign policy, whether there's a divide between Democrats and Republicans, whether it should be more diplomatic or military oriented, has really risen.
By the way,
what you've
Michael,
seen is the ISIS effect.
Michael, let me just, while we keep this up, we have a lot of people that listen driving into work.
Right.
Support for various anti-terror activities. This is really the headline. Airstrikes, 77%. Assassination of leaders, 73%.
Well, that's Obama.
The most shocking, U.S. ground troops.
Yeah.
Michael, now 60%.
Wow.
6 in 10 Americans now support ground troops.
Yeah, 9 in 10 Americans don't have anybody in the military.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Joe, I found this number striking also, and another one that kind of blew me away. 54% of Republicans, and I think maybe 44% of Democrats said they would support U.S. troops taking out Iran's nuclear facilities if Iran cheats on the deal. I thought that number was remarkably high. In general, I think what we're seeing here is the ISIS effect. Another finding in that poll is that the number of Americans, particularly Republicans, who call Islamic fundamentalism a critical threat to the U.S. has just skyrocketed since the last time they did this poll, which was, of course, before these terrible beheadings that began last summer, last September. And so the American public is in a much more confrontational mood and much more of a sense that we have to get back out in the world and kind of join this fight that has come to us, unfortunately.
You can check out Michael's discussion on these findings at thechicagocouncil.org. It's tomorrow.
And Joe, can I just say very quickly, you know, I accept those numbers, but those numbers would change very quickly the moment American boots are on the ground, our people start getting killed. We've seen this in the past where there's great support for getting in and there's a great initial support, but that can change if we run into difficulty once we're on the ground. So I think we need to take those numbers with a certain grain of salt.
All right. Thank you so much, Congressman Adam Schiff. Greatly appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Michael Crowley, as well. And that certainly is true with Iraq, and it's true with a lot of other.
Oh, no. I mean, look, we were more weary.
But people want to know that there's a plan. I mean, they can shift in the other direction, too. If they feel like you're making gains, if they feel like you're keeping the homeland safer, they can go the other direction as well.
Still ahead.